Welcome, everyone. I'm David Warren, President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford. Thanks for joining us for what I know will be an inspiring conversation. In a 2017 essay called Keeping the Faith, Resilience in the Jewish Tradition, Rabbi Deborah Waxman shares the American Psychological Association's definition of resilience. Quote, the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, and even significant sources of stress. Rabbi Waxman goes on to quote George Vaillant, a preeminent Harvard psychiatrist and a pioneer in the study of adult development, who views resilience as a twig with a fresh, green, living core that springs back and continues to grow after pressure. Tonight, we will hear stories not just of resilience, but generosity and grace in the face of unthinkable adversity. Many of us are familiar with Rabbi Philip Lazowski's Holocaust story, but his wife Ruth's story is less well known. Ruth and her family, the Rabinowitzes, successfully evaded the Nazis for 2 years in the forest near their home, and her parents, Miriam and Morris, lent a life-saving hand to other Jews in need at great personal risk to themselves and their family. At a time when the American Jewish community is increasingly under threat, we would do well to remember the stories and the values that define the Rabinowitz and Lazowski families, and to emulate their resilience. Before we begin the conversation, I want to thank Voices of Hope for working with us to conceive this program, and our incredible colleagues at the other 6 Connecticut Jewish Federations, and the Lazowski and Rabinowitz families for continuing to inspire us. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our featured speakers. Rebecca Frankel, a West Hartford native, is a longtime editor and journalist. In addition to Into the Forest, which was recently named one of the 10 best history books of 2021 by Smithsonian magazine, she authored the New York Times bestselling book, War Dogs, Tales of Canine Heroism, History, and Love. Previously, she was the executive editor of Foreign Policy magazine and the managing editor of Moment magazine. Rebecca has been a guest on Conan, PBS NewsHour, and BBC World News, among others. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post. Elizabeth Lazowski works in children's editorial at Chronicle Books in San Francisco. Elizabeth is a graduate of Hampshire College, where she studied creative writing, children's literature, and anti-racist pedagogy. She aims to work on stories that address the overlooked spaces in and outside of the US. Who has not been, and is still not being, fairly represented in the literary canon? Elizabeth grew up in West Hartford, and she is the granddaughter of Ruth and Rabbi Philip Lazowski. Please welcome Rebecca Frankel and Elizabeth Lazowski.
Hi, everyone. David, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really so happy to be here. All of the Connecticut events I've been fortunate enough to do are kind of homecoming for me and for the book, but it's a special honor that tonight is hosted by 2 such important organizations in Connecticut's Jewish community. I'm also happy always to talk about Into the Forest, but it's very special that Elizabeth is joining me for this conversation. I've so enjoyed getting to know her over the past few months. The whole family has been very warm and welcoming of me, but Elizabeth, I feel, is very much a kindred spirit. We both have the reading hearts of 2 book nerds, I think, and that's been wonderful to talk about too. And I know many of you tuning in tonight have read Into the Forest, maybe. Many more of you are connected to the Lazowski and Langerman families. You know the Lazowskis the way I know them, by attending Beth Hillel Synagogue in Connecticut or the Emmanuel in West Hartford. Or perhaps you just heard Ruth and Rabbi Lazowski on StoryCorps this past Friday. But I'm going to just give a very brief summary of the book story for anyone who's coming to this talk fresh. Into the Forest is a nonfiction book, and it does center around, as David mentioned, the Rabinowitz family, husband and wife, Morris and Miriam, and their two daughters, Ruth Lazowski and Toby Langerman, or Rochel and Tanya Rabinowitz, as they're called through most of the book. It covers a period of about 25 years, beginning in the early 1930s, when the Rabinowitzes were still just a happy Jewish family living in a small town of what was then Poland, until the war broke out in 1939. And it follows a timeline that includes everything the family encounters. So that starts with the Soviet occupation, then the Nazi occupation, the town as a ghetto to which all of the Jews of the region are interned. And that includes details of Miriam Rabinowitz's act of courage when she does intervene on behalf of a young Philip Lazowski and saves his life. And from there, we follow the family's miraculous escape from the ghetto to the forest and their 2 harrowing years in the woods. And through the years after the war, after they're liberated in 1944. And lastly, the family's immigration to the United States. And the book rounds out in the mid-1950s with an uplifting ending for a Holocaust story with the wedding of Ruth and Philip Lazowski in Hartford, Connecticut. And in order to reconstruct the Rabinowitz family's lives during that timeline, and in order to get all of the context and the rich detail, not just of their lives, but the people they knew and the places they lived and the history of that time, I wrote about their surrounding communities as well. And those outer circles included extended family members, neighbors in their hometowns of Zhetel and Novogrudok, which are now part of Belarus, the people with them in the Zhetel ghetto, and then the splintered families and the partisan fighters they would meet in the forest, and then the other refugees they meet in Europe after the war, and the newfound families and friends they would eventually find in the United States. But actually, in a very fun twist for me, I get to ask the first question of the night. But before I do, I just want to let everyone who's watching know that you should please feel free to enter your questions for me or Elizabeth in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can after our chat. But so Elizabeth, so we've talked about this before, just the two of us and with your family. I know your grandparents' love story, Ruth and Rabbi, as I call them, is what I've been calling like the stuff of local legends. So I know that it's something that you and your cousins grew up with, very much like, from the time you were really young, but also that the community that you grew up in probably knew this story or found out about it at some point. So I'm wondering, the book being published, if that had an impact, if any, on you, on your family. Do you guys sit around talking about it? Tell me.
Oh man, do we sit around and talking about something? Always, always. What?
Of course.
No, I mean the book. Wow. I think I can really speak for only myself here, truthfully. And I think I found out about the book, and as you know, I work in the industry,
Yes, you
and I
do.
pulled some strings, and I emailed the head of the person who's doing your publicity, and I said, please send me an advanced reader's copy. I work in the industry, and also, I'm the granddaughter and the great niece of the people who are being depicted in this book. And they sent it to me, and that was before you and I had met or talked. And I got to read this book in just very quiet moments in my life and in my apartment. And it was still when quarantine was pretty big in San Francisco. I am zooming in from San Francisco. And so we were also pretty locked down, and it was just able to be me and this book and my roommate checking in on me as she hears me like sobbing through the walls. And, this story for me, I say I can really only speak for myself because my family and I feel so differently about this story. It is the stuff of local legend. My Zadie and my Bubby talk about it all the time. Their love story is so incredibly epic and romantic and impossible and coincidental. And for some people in my family, it's such a huge badge of honor and such a thing to celebrate. And it is for me too, right? But it's also this really incredible and personal story that I don't enjoy talking about, because you can't talk about their beautiful love story without talking about everything else, right? You can't talk about it without talking about our world, and with the things that happened to my grandparents and people and my great aunt Toby and people I so deeply and desperately love. And so I would only ever do this event for you, Rebecca, but it's not something I love talking about. So for me, the book and being able to enjoy it and read it for the first time in that really intimate, special kind of cocooned way that I was, right? Like the majority of my family had not read it yet. I was able to keep it as something that was just for me, and wasn't a phenomenon and wasn't something I would like that was going to be at bookstores, and able to absorb it in that way, which was so incredibly special. And then, for my family, I know I just literally said I can't speak for my family, but I'm going to. That's why I'm here. But also a small disclaimer that, everything I say about them is through my own lens and through my own life and relationship with them. And so sometimes I'm going to get details and facts wrong, and that's all on me. But, I think for them, it's such a beautiful recognition, right, of their life and of this family story and of this town story, right, that now has an opportunity to sort of grow legs and grow nationally. And I think, I called Toby this morning, my great aunt Toby, and I asked her, I was like, I'm doing this thing tonight.
She's watching.
She is watching.
She's watching.
And I asked her, what do you think about this book? Like, it's out, this is your life. And what else do you wish people knew? And Toby was like, well, what do you mean? And I said, like, there's this book, and Rebecca obviously did all this amazing research, but, what else do you wish people knew about you and your family now that you have an excuse and a chance to really talk about all of this? And she kind of takes a beat and she goes, well, she did it. And I was like, what? and Toby goes, well, she did it. She captured my parents, how they worked. He captured everything. There's nothing else to say. And then she asks me, and she's like, well, do you think she did it? And I'm like,
Of course she did. Of course you did. It's not like Toby. And for many people watching, if you know Toby, and I've said this before, that the first time I called her to have a conversation and to interview her, she interviewed me. I didn't really get to ask any questions. And that was great. And that was fine, because when somebody is the kind of access that I wanted and that I really needed to do justice and to get, I did not, and I could not have met Morris and Miriam. They passed away just after I was born, both of them. So that was not time was not going to let that happen. But I do feel like I know them, which is sort of a strange thing to say after, just acknowledging that I've never met them. But the kind of access that I wanted to know everything as much as I possibly could. And I know that for each family member that I was able to speak with, before, during the research process, and actually since, because we've had the opportunity through various events to be with each other, and I've gotten to meet, all of the immediate family at this point, or interact with them. And so I know that it's really emotional terrain. Of course, how could it not be? Even if your family doesn't have a Holocaust story, history and relationships, they're difficult. And so these interviews can be really tough. But one thing we've talked about is both Ruth and Toby and your Zaidi, Rabbi Lazowski, and he's done many, many interviews of many different kinds over the years, being a prominent rabbi in the Hartford area. But I watched many times the Shoah Foundation interviews that your grandparents and Toby did. And my first time watching, I was almost surprised in some way, because it was very upsetting conversations. And these were interviews that were conducted in I think it was the mid 1990s. So it was many years before I was able to start having conversations and interviews for the book. And so, there's so much grief and trauma in these memories and in this history. And I think it's clearly still there, just surfaced in different ways during my time with them. And I can, only imagine that it exists in everyone in your family, and to some degree, just in different ways.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And, one of the things I've been thinking about in just after you asked me to do this, I had the opportunity to really think about my family, not just as like my family, but as, people who I would get the opportunity to talk about, and what would I want to say about them. And also, just side note, thank you, because that was just such a joyful, lovely experience for me. I think everyone who knows me intimately knows that my family are the most important people to me, deeply and truly the loves of my life, and just my favorite subject. Like, all my friends know literally everything about them, like more than they wanted to know.
And you guys are a close family. Now that I've had the, just the privilege, but also just the opportunity to spend time with you guys together, you're close. Where does that come from?
Yeah, no.
A leading question.
No, I love it. This is where I wanted to get to. So I absolutely love it. Yeah. We are, to quote my great aunt Toby, who is Ruth Lazowski's sister, one of the little girls in the story. She dubs us weirdly close. I remember.
Close.
Yeah, no, that's literally what she says. I had driven the 2 hours when I was still in college, from college to her house on a weekend. And I get there and I sit down, and she looks at me and she goes, we're weirdly close. And I was like, do you want me to leave? Is that what this is? But I think all of that closeness, like, ultimately comes from my bubby and from Toby. I think that, we've talked about that my Zadie, Rabbi Phil Lazowski, has this really big platform in Connecticut, right? He's a rabbi. He's the chaplain for the state Senate. He was chaplain for the Hartford Police Department and for the Hartford Hospital. And so people know him. And, when people talk about us, they talk about him in conversation. He's sort of become this larger than life figure, which is so beautiful. But in the inner workings of my family, those larger than life figures are really Bubby and Toby. Like, they have brought us all together at every single moment in our lives. Like, I have no memory of my childhood that is not with my family. Like, and that is them being so clear about what is important, and what their expectations are of us. And they, and that was passed down, honestly, to their sons. I mean, to my bubby's sons, to my dad, Barry, and my two uncles, David and Alan. They all married these three beautiful, incredible, strong women. My mom, Cindy, my aunt, Marcia, and my aunt, Dana. And my mom and my aunts also have really strong ties to their family. And so when they married in, those families were just from Toby. And and that was something that when we were younger, if I can share some embarrassing stories, that we kind of took advantage of, because Bubby, our love language, I'm going to say, as a Lazowski clan, our love language is giving each other a rough time, a bit of a hard time. And Zadie and I, very particular, like, my relationship with my Zadie is us kind of sniping at each other in a lovely and loving, deep way. But as my sister is so fond of saying, I'm going to say, was past tense, I'm better now, was someone who was better at dishing it out than taking it in. And so I would say something to my Zadie, and I would make sure that I was like behind my bubby when I said something kind of mean. And he
That's
would
where I
say,
would stand.
yeah, absolutely. And he would say something back, and my bubby would turn to him and go, "What are you doing? Take it back. Tell her you love her. Tell her you love her right now." And like,
Oh,
I'm just there, like sticking my tongue out.
yeah. So you talk about Ruth, or Rachel, as she's called in the book, and Toby, or Tanya, in the book, and so much about my exploration of this family did happen through sisters, because the book is about the Rabinowitz family, Morris and Miriam, and their two daughters, and everything that happens to them. But another very important character in this story is, of course, Miriam's sister, Luba. And Miriam and Luba were incredibly close. And Luba was with the family pretty much from the time of maybe it was right after the Soviet occupation. She came and she stayed with them. And both Ruth, your Bubby, and Toby talked so much about her and how much she meant to them and how much she took care of them. And so, this is a story about a very close family. And I've said so many times during these conversations about the book that the reason why I think, two things. The reason why I think this family survived intact, which was an incredible thing to have happen for a family of four to all survive and to survive together, to not split off from each other. And to survive the forest, because those conditions and what they went through after they escaped their ghetto was incredibly brutal and hard, is because of how strong a marriage there was, because of how strong Miriam and Luba's relationship was, and also because of how well loved, your Bubby and Toby were by the family that surrounded them. Because I watched so many testimonies from people who survived Jettel, which was, a remarkable Jewish community in Poland before the war, unique in its own ways. And there are people who have read the book and reconnected, and that's been a wonderful thing to find other Jewish families who've, originated in Jettel. But their experiences, the people who went into the woods, are horrific. And even the testimonies of people who would have been about Ruth and Toby's age, or maybe a little bit older when they were in the forest, the way that they speak about it it's so much trauma. It's all terrible. But your Bubby and Toby, remarkably have some happy memories that they held on to. I mean, I don't think there's any romanticizing their experience, and I did not want to do that, but I did want very much to make sure that people came away from encountering this family and realizing how much of their childhood they maintained throughout. And that, I think seeing your family, it makes a lot of sense to me that these are the people that came after, Morris and Miriam, and these are the people that came out of this family, and that these are the kinds of families and the family life that Ruth and Toby have cultivated, and the sister relationships that I see. It's all very familiar, and maybe in addition to them being very warm and accepting, which I feel grateful for, because it could have been that this book had been written and that the family was like, we don't like this. This is, we're not happy about this. And I was braced for that. I have to say, I was braced for that a little bit. The first hurdle came after your grandparents looked at an early draft of the manuscript, and then Toby got her read. And then I held my breath when the marketing team at St. Martin's Press told me that they'd mailed you an advanced reader copy. And I'm so glad they did, but I was like, wait, what? Who's getting an early read? Oh God. And I was like, really worried about it. But it's a lot of family and strength, and people I hear from readers, which is a wonderful thing, and I try and share this with everybody. But that is the thing that people are identifying with. They feel like they got to see Morris and Miriam, and they're grateful they got to see them as a happy family before the war. and then to get a part of their experience after the war. So it is a Holocaust book. It is a Holocaust history, but it's as full a portrait as I could possibly offer.
Yeah.
So yeah, it all makes sense.
No, I mean, let's talk about what a full portrait you do offer. I reread the book last night because I still prepare for everything like I am a college student cramming before a test. And it's just really incredible how much is in that book, how much detail, how much history. Like, yes, my family, but just about the world and what was going on and how you situate everything. And one of the things I was so struck by, and I was struck by it the first time, right? But the first read was sort of like me processing and it being my family. And now I was struck by just like, there's so many dates, there's so much history, there's so many people involved in order to paint this full landscape and this full picture. Like, how do you keep it all straight? What does your desk look like when you're writing this book? Like, I am envisioning strings across your office to
Kind
dates.
of.
Like, what is that process like?
Well, for me, and I probably would approach this in a similar fashion, regardless of how much testimony or memory there was just from the family. But I had to understand what was happening around them in order to understand what was happening to them and to put it into context before I could even begin to write about it. But because my access points to this history was your Bubby and Toby, was Ruth Lazowski and Toby Langerman, Rachel and Tanya as adults, who were very, very many decades away from the time when they actually experienced the events in the book, most of them. They had held on to stories that they had been told by their parents. And another extraordinary detail I want to just toss in there is that Morris and Miriam talked about what happened to them with their family after the war, which I think is a unique way to, not a lot of Holocaust survivors talked about the things that happened to them in the same way your family did. But even still, even though they did have this sort of openness about their experiences, they were children when these things happened to them. So a lot of their memories, though they were very clear and crisp and had a lot of detail, they weren't necessarily lined up in a chronological timeline. They're sort of emotionally rooted to memory impact points, I guess is a way to kind of say it. So that's sort of what got me into initially watching all these other testimonies of people who were in Novogrudek when your family was in Novogrudek, in between the Soviets and the Nazis occupying that part of Poland, just so that I could get as much, intake as many details. And then Rzeszów being a small town, which is where they were when Morris and Miriam were when they started their marriage and had Ruth and Toby, and where they ended up in the ghetto. It was a small town, so the people who survived had a common history. And so it was sort of easier for me than maybe in a big city like Warsaw, say, to kind of pinpoint who the people were, to pinpoint when the Nazis came, what it looked like, what the ghetto looked like, all of the important buildings in town, and people described them. So what I started to do was I had an outline that was actually probably just as long, if not longer, than the uncut or unedited version of this manuscript the first time. And I just started to put in notes to myself in a chronological order, because over a period of years, I would have lost, it couldn't exist all in my head because it just wouldn't have been accessible. At certain points I was drawing and I was taping pieces of paper together so I could get as long of a timeline as possible and putting Post-it notes. And part of my job was making sure that every detail could be verified with accounts, historical documentation as possible. Memory is so important. It is the bedrock of this kind of history, and so much of it was lost. So much of the record keeping was of this tiny town, of the ghetto. It was lost, but I did find documentation. I had help from historians, and a woman at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London was tremendously helpful in finding documentation for the family, primarily after the war, and pinpointing where they were, because the first place where they really landed, even though it was temporary, it was for a long time, was in Italy. And frankly, Nazi memos were a little bit helpful in tracking down, when they came in, the number of people that were being held, the number of people that had been killed, where they were. And then I met Ted Weinstone, or Tuvia Weinstein, who lives in Memphis, Tennessee, who was at or invited to your grandparents' wedding, but he was with the Rabinowitz family, with Ruth and Toby in the woods for a really long period of time. And he has the most astounding memory. All of his memories were tied to exact dates. He was able to draw me a map of where the family was in the forest. And I spent 2 very long days with him in Memphis. And his Shoah Foundation testimony is hours and hours long. So that was really helpful in sort of constructing their whereabouts in the woods and where they moved, and sort of who was with them at the time. And there's a man named Chaim Weinstein who lives in Israel, who has a little bit of memory of your family at that time. And there were other documentation and testimonies that were collected right after the war, as opposed to many, many years later, that had mention of the Rabinowitz family or the Dvoretsky family. And so it was just sort of finding all these details and then trying as best as I could to put them into place. But I really did come to feel very close to some of these other people that I only encountered in testimony. And wonderfully, I've heard from some of their family members. Actually, I just heard from a woman who grew up in New Hampshire next to Morris and Miriam. She just emailed me yesterday and remembers them dearly and very fondly, and remembers your dad and your Uncle Alan coming to visit. So it's a lot of information, but I do have it sorted in my head now. And I've even said this to you, and I say this to Toby. I know more about the Rabinowitz family than I know about the Frankel family at this point. So maybe we can trade.
And we say right back to you that you know more about our family than we know about our family. So that's an incredible trade of information. But, one of the things I'm always struck by, and as you talk and just throughout this whole process, is that you are a writer and you could literally write any story, right? You have that option. And then within specifically the Holocaust canon, there's been both at once so much written about the Holocaust, and also not that much. We have sort of the danger of a single story about it, right? There are a lot of writings about the concentration camps and about very specific parts of the Holocaust. To the point where I remember when I was younger, and actually I need to text my cousins after and see if they had this experience, but when I was younger and talking about my family, people would tell me I was wrong, that no Jews lived in the forest, and that I was not understanding what my grandparents were telling me, and that they were in concentration camps. And so there was all of that to deal with. But how did you choose this story? Why was it for you that this was the story? And then I guess further narrowing that, right? Why tell it through the lens of my Bubby's side of the family, my Bubby and my Toby's side of the family?
Yeah. I, having also been an editor in some of my other parts of my career, and having written another book that was very research and reporting intensive, which I really enjoy doing, it has to be a labor of love. And for me, I had to feel like it's a topic and a story that is inspiring to me, which means that I am ready to get up every day and dig as deep as you really need to dig into a story like this. And certainly, something that feels meaningful and feels important. And I just thought, having known this story for a very long time, growing up in West Hartford and going to Beth Hillel Synagogue, and year Zadie was at my bat mitzvah, and my rabbi for so long. They were always really important people in my life, And when I was working at Moment Magazine, we did a feature called Love Stories from the Holocaust, which we felt like, and I really love that feature, was another way to tell uplifting stories about that time, but also tell important stories about that time. Your grandparents were featured, and a reporter, Lisa Newman, wrote about them. And so I just thought, like, maybe this could be the next thing that I worked on. And I emailed your Bubby, and I called her and I said, I'd really like to write this book about your experience. And originally my idea was to write about both your grandparents and move back and forth between the two different stories so that they intersected at those moments, and then end, of course, with the wedding. And your grandmother was like, well, you can write my story, because of course your grandfather, Rabbi, has written his own story. And she was like, you're going to write my story. And I was like, okay, so we'll start there and see what happens. And I have to say that, I always knew about Miriam. I always knew that Miriam, for reasons that I can only wonder about, she just, without hesitating, was willing to take a boy she didn't know, claim him as her son so that he could make it through this selection in the ghetto where 1,200 people were killed that day, and he made it safely through by being with her. I always knew that story, but I didn't know what happened to the Rabinowitz family really after that, and I didn't know that they had been in the woods. I think I probably knew a little bit, but I didn't know the whole story. And so once I started to dig into it, there was no way that there would have been, maybe volume 1 and volume 2, but there was more story almost than I could have handled for one book. And I just feel like in some ways it makes sense to me. There's so many strong women. I'm saying my access points. The people that were the living memory and the living, subjects of the book are women, and so it just made sense in some ways to have it be this story. And every detail I came across, there were more details, and so I just feel so grateful that this was the thing that I got to do, the book that I got to write.
And once you start talking with them, for those of you who don't know, my great aunt Toby is the funniest, wittiest, most sharp-tongued woman I have ever met in my life. Would you agree with that assessment, Rebecca?
She is watching. And this is the thing about sisters, is that I love how they talk about their relationship with each other. I love how close they are, even now, and clearly through various points in their lives. They're really sisters, and they each told me stories about each other that were very, very funny, and that I, might get in trouble for sharing that didn't make it into the book. But it's, it was a lot with love, and the narratives didn't conflict very much. And I think, you have dinner with your family and then you go and talk about it later, and everybody has a different idea about what just happened. And there was a real cohesion and a real, the history is very much a shared history. Given all of the dynamics that are within a family. And when you talk about Holocaust stories, I shouldn't be surprised that people doubted that, your family's history is part of this history of the forest, the Jews who ran to the forest, because it was so hard for me to find these stories. There isn't one giant book of all of the stories of the Jews who went into the forest. There's a wonderful book by Alan Levine, who I used as a sort of a counselor through some of this history and finding it, who wrote a book called The Fugitives of the Forest. And he writes a lot about the partisan history, which, of course, coincides with your family's story, not necessarily the Rabinowitz side so much, but your grandfather's and, the Bielski partisan story. That's very well known, but more well known than the rest of the forest history. But it isn't something that was known very much afterwards. And I heard from so many people who, wrote to me afterwards, who wanted to share their family stories, who hadn't. They were, or people who said, I never knew this. And that's rewarding too, for me to feel like, there's a contribution to be made there, because World War II is a very well-trod genre. And so is Holocaust literature to a certain degree. But you're right. I mean, we hear a lot about things that we already know, and it's less often that we hear new stories, or stories that, people, there are historians, of course, who wrote to tell me that, I've been writing about this for years, and that's absolutely true. But, there are cycles of things that are of the moment. So articles or books that came out in 1980, they're out of print, or, they haven't, they're on the shelf, but they're, off on a shelf that's a little bit further away than some of the other things that are coming out now. So it is, people knowing this story is a contribution in a lot of different ways, and the history part is part of that too. Yeah.
I want to take a moment to pause and just say that we are going to actually switch to audience questions in like 5 minutes. So if you have any, put them in the Q&A box, and we will do our very best to answer them. I'm also going to take this moment to give a plug that this book came out, Into the Forest came out, I'm going to say September 9th, 7th. It came out first week of September.
7th.
The 7th. Okay, I did it. Okay, it came out September 7th. So hopefully, I mean, I know everyone here watching has already read it and loved it, but just in case you haven't, you can buy it anywhere books are sold. I personally hope you take a moment to support your local indie bookstore, which, if you're in Connecticut, which I know a lot of you are, that would be RJ Julia's in Madison, Connecticut, and they have a great online store, or you can call them and order it, and they are very friendly and they will help you out. So everyone, please buy this book. I'm trying to think. Oh my gosh, of course, I'm here to promote books. I'm here to give you a plug anytime.
Thank you.
One of the things I think about the most, and I'm going to say the real foundation of our friendship, I am claiming you as a friend. We haven't talked about that officially, but we're claiming it right here in public, is that I got to spend an entire full day with you, November 6th, which I do just want to share that my family suffered an incredible loss at the beginning of last year. My cousin Jack passed away. He was 24, and due to COVID and the pandemic, we weren't allowed to really be together and mourn. And so we had a service for him many months later, November 6th. And Rebecca, you were so gracious enough to come, and we spent the entire day together. And one of the things that was so joyous, besides the fact that I got to see like my entire family for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic, which was overwhelming to me, was just to see my family interact with you, like when your very first question was about how did they, interpret the book, how did they take it? But like, you are family, like they have claimed you into this, they are not letting you go. And it's so special to see what writing this story has done for my family, how we talk about it differently with each other, I would say, is probably the biggest thing. I mean, we all know the story, but it's sort of something that like you've heard all your life. And I think you've breathed new life into these memories. One of the things that my sister said is that, like, obviously she knows who our great grandparents are. She knows who Morris and Miriam are, but she got to experience Morris in an entire new way. She got to know him as such a different human being than just this like really huge looming patriarch in our family, which he still is, but you gave us so much more. And I don't know how many of us have actually looked to you in the eye and said thank you, because I think we're all a little awkward and don't know how to broach it. But it's just, being on this journey with you has been tremendously special, and it's been a real gift to get to know you and to just do all of this with you. So thank you.
Wow, thank you for saying that. That was a special day for me. I know now, certainly having been there for the service, what a special person Jack was and how well loved he was. Um, but in a way, for me, I've gotten to know Morris and Miriam and your family. Certainly, Ruth and Rabbi have been in the background of my life since I was 5 years old. And Toby now is in my life in a really wonderful way. But my closeness really came through the process of book writing. And, it would have been very sad if that connection had to taper off once the book came out. So to be able to continue and celebrate and share this stuff with your family has been just a wonderful bonus for me in the best of ways. And it means that the process isn't going to continue. I don't have to say goodbye to anyone, because I think that's a sad thing that happens in any project that you've been in when it ends. The work is done, and so you move on to the next thing. But I don't have to do that. So thank you, thank
No,
you.
we've got you. Our
Yes.
claws are in you. You don't get to move on.
Okay, I don't want to. I don't want to. All
Um,
right.
could we answer some of these? Should we look at some of these?
Yes, absolutely.
Drawing me in immediately is hello to Elizabeth. My name is Bonnie North and wrote to Rebecca over the weekend. I grew up in Canaan, New Hampshire, next door to Miriam and Morris. I knew your father, Barry, when he and Alan would come to spend the summers. Miriam and my mother were quite close, and I remember Miriam as such a warm and welcoming woman. It's such an honor to hear you tonight. I'm lost in memory of your great grandparents. Man, I'm gonna cry. I really thought I was gonna make it through this whole thing, and I was gonna be
You were so close.
I was so close. Oh, thank you, Bonnie. It's so nice to hear from you, and I know my family is watching us tonight, so I know that I'm also expressing my thanks, their thanks, right now. Thank
No,
you.
I'm glad Bonnie sent me that email. Got very excited when I heard from her, and she sent me a few anecdotes about the family that I hadn't heard from, and it's just getting to know them even more, even though the book is already written, is a real gift.
Rebecca,
Yeah.
I know that we have said that everyone, we're assuming everyone here has read the book, came out on
Mhm.
September 7th, but just in case there are a few
Yeah.
people, I'm noticing a few questions about, can you give us specifically like which forest, just a little bit of geography in terms of
Sure.
this book?
So this forest, the big forest, the Bialveja forest, is gigantic. It's very, very massive. And so where the Rabinowitz family was for most of it, although as Alan Levine, the author of Fugitives of the Forest, one of the other historians and authors I consulted at different points, said, in the woods, it's not like there's a sign that says you're now leaving the Lipichanska forest and entering the Naliboki forest. But the family was primarily in the Lipichanska forest, or the Lipichani forest, which was sort of right outside of Zhetel. So what was then Eastern Poland, but is now Belarus. Zhetel and Novogrudek, where the family had roots, was in Belarus. But the Bielski partisans, and I know where your grandfather was a bit north of where they were. And there's actually a little map in the book, which is helpful. So you can take a look at it if you get it, or maybe I'll post it online somewhere so people can see it.
Oh no, we're buying the book. This is
Okay,
another
sorry.
plug to buy the book.
Okay. Sorry, I'm terrible at that part.
That's why I'm here.
That's good. Thank you.
All right, this is from Diana Kleben. I'm so sorry if I mispronounce your name. Please have grace and forgive me. I'm so sorry about that. Who is still alive of all the main characters of the book, and who still lives in Connecticut? We both know the answer to this, but Rebecca, please take this.
Sure. So Ruth and Philip Lazowski, the Rabinowitz's eldest daughter, Rochel, is still in Connecticut. And they're about and around, very active. Again, I was just saying that they did an interview with StoryCorps, and I was getting messages at 7:30 on Friday morning from people who were listening to NPR and heard them. Of course, Tanya Rabinowitz, Toby Langerman is in Massachusetts. Luba, unfortunately, is no longer with us. I know her family is around. There are cousins that are mentioned in the book who are around, who were involved. Ted Weinstone, who in the book, I believe it's chapter 8, it's Tuvia Weinstein, or as they called him in the forest, the boy with the frozen feet. I know that he has a book that he's put out that I believe is on Amazon. His family is in Memphis. Yeah. But let's see.
I love so much of that. I love how much you know about my family. I'm like, yeah, that's true.
Well, there are other cousins, cousins of cousins or descendants of cousins who I know are still around. They're not necessarily characters in the book, but the descendants are around and part of the family history. There's a question by Alexis Zinkerman, and they ask, Rebecca, what and who were your sources in writing your book? Did you use ethnographic sources or reference books or travel? I will say one of the biggest COVID disappointments for me was that I did not get to travel for the research for the book and the reporting, and I had a plan. I was going to go to Belarus. There's a woman there that I've gotten to know who used to run the Jewish Resistance Museum in Novogrudek. Her name is Tamara Vershitskaya. I met her in New York, and she was going to take me around Novogrudek and Zhetel and into the woods. But I canceled the trip because it was in the first summer of the COVID pandemic, and traveling there was not an option for me at the time. I do hope to still go one day. My invitation is still open, she tells me, so I hope to do that. My references were many. The majority of the storytelling came from testimony, and so much testimony. There were so many families from Zhetel and from Novogrudek whose testimony I relied on. One of the families, the Kaminsky family of Zhetel, the surviving family members, many of them ended up in Australia. One of the surviving daughters, Leah Kaminsky, I've connected with. She's a writer. Her grandfather was Hers Kaminsky. He was also in the woods. And he also, like Morris and Miriam, helped out other refugees who were hiding in the forest. Primarily, he took in orphans and widows and people who were considered sort of undesirable additions to camps at that time because they wouldn't have been providers of safety or food necessarily. They were people who needed taking care of, and he took them in. It was a lot of testimony. Again, I even looked at Nazi memos. Testimony that was collected right after the war was tremendously important, but also very hard to find. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum archives, the Fortunoff Library. There's so much, but again, like we were just talking about, when it comes to the forest experience, it is completely disparate. It is in the lines. It's not in the headlines. It's in the in the paragraphs. It's little details. It's footnotes. It was fairly hard to come by.
I am seeing 3 separate questions about what stories I grew up with. And, Rebecca points out in the book and has pointed out during this talk that my great-grandparents, Miriam and Morris, spoke really freely about their experiences in growing up in the woods, and my Bubby and my Toby growing up heard about it a lot. But, I think and once again, this is back to what I was saying in the earlier part of the program, that I can really only and truly speak for myself. But my impression is that when, my family came to America, that there was a large pressure to assimilate and to become American and to really, I guess I move on with their lives in terms of not, and also a fear, right? A true fear, which is all part of assimilation, of to not truly broadcast what had happened with them. And so as a result, My dad, who is Barry, who's their oldest son, and I want to say there's quite an age difference. They have three sons, and my dad is the oldest, and the youngest, David, there's 10 years. And so, as you can imagine, that means that my dad was literally going off to college when David was 8 years old, and so that's like a very different growing up. But for my dad, he didn't really hear a lot of their stories. And my uncle Alan had some memories of Miriam, his grandmother, telling him, but not so much of my Bubby and Zadie being really open about it. And it wasn't until my Zadie started, kind of sat down and started to write his self-published autobiography, Faith and Destiny, that some of those conversations came up. And my dad has this memory of kind of going into my Zadie's office, his dad's office, and being like, "What are you doing?" And Zadie being like, "Oh, I'm writing this memoir about my life in the Holocaust." So I think that was much later in my dad's life. He, I think, was already in college. But I will say that for me growing up with it, I don't remember a time where it wasn't talked about. Like, I don't remember a time where I didn't know all these stories, where everyone wasn't so open and honest about it. And I think, I don't know if that switch was like Zadie started writing his autobiography and they started talking about it more in the house, or exactly where that came from. But I know that by the time Bubby and Zadie had grandkids, by the time my oldest cousin Jesse was born, like, we were talking about it. There was family history, and it was so important to talk about it. So I grew up with everything. Of course, Rebecca was able to give quite a bit of detail, that maybe wouldn't have naturally come up, but pretty much everything was known.
Yeah. It is really interesting because, of course, I always knew this part about them too, growing up, going to Hebrew school at Beth Hillel, where your grandmother was the fourth grade teacher for most of the time that she was there, and Rabbi was the rabbi. So let's see. I think we have only a couple of minutes left. I'm wondering. So in talking about that, Stephen Placker has a question saying that, yes, my decades-long connection with Rabbi and Ruth and the extended family. And then he asks, what facts or stories that you uncovered in researching and writing this book most surprised you? And I will say I was certainly surprised by the numbers of families who were in the woods, not necessarily in the same woods, but who had a similar experience. It was just, I just didn't know. I just didn't have a sense of the outlines of what that history looked like. I was also very much surprised a bit more about learning just through the personal stories that your grandmother and Toby shared with me about their time in Connecticut. Because Connecticut, my growing up experience is that there is a very robust Jewish community. There are so many synagogues, every kid, for the most part, bar and bat mitzvahs are a sort of communal experience, right? It's something that we all know. My non-Jewish friends all knew lots of Yiddish and knew very much about the, Jewish traditions and holidays and customs. But I was surprised to hear that they had difficulty integrating into the Jewish community that was here, right? The American Jewish community. I understand it, but I was still a little bit surprised by it, that it wasn't a more embracive community. And I think that was a fairly, I don't want to say universal, because certainly I don't know, but I don't think it was super uncommon for Jews who experienced the Holocaust to come to the United States and find themselves sort of, in a community, even a Jewish community, of people who had no idea what they had just experienced and could not relate on any level. And there's a story in the book about an interaction that Morris has with one of his relatives, where he's speaking about the scarcity of food and shelter in the woods, and this relative sort of dismisses him, and he's like, well, we had ration cards here too. And it's just it's a very wild connection to try and make, to point out that there are similarities between those two experiences. And so, Toby has told me, and your grandmother has told me, that I think it was easier for them in some ways to be a part of the refugee community in Italy, where they were with non-Jews, but people who had experienced the war, not the Holocaust, but the war, and some of, it was a little bit similar. They were a little bit more welcoming. But I think we're ending our time. Oh, this has been so wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this with me. Thank you, everyone who's just been sitting and listening, and all the questions we didn't get to. I'm really sorry that we're running out of time, but this has been a genuine pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm interrupting you. We're gonna bring on Kathy Fishman from Voices for Hope to close out our program.
What a memorable story and discussion. Thank you, Rebecca, for documenting this important part of history, and Elizabeth for your thoughtful conversation and insights. As Rebecca said, my name is Kathy Fishman, and I'm the Executive Director of Voices of Hope. Thank you also to everyone who joined us tonight. We had an amazing turnout and truly appreciate your support. Last but not least, a special thank you to the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford for helping us bring this program to fruition, and to the other 6 Connecticut federations for their partnership. For those of you who are new to Voices of Hope, our organization was founded by Alan Lazowski, Ruth's son. So tonight is especially meaningful for us to share this important story about survival, triumph, and love. Our mission is to promote a culture of courage to stand up against hatred through Holocaust and genocide education and remembrance. Having Elizabeth join us as a descendant of survivors and share her perspective is especially meaningful and important to our organization as we prepare the next generation to share their family stories. Tonight's program is the first in the Voices of Hope 2022 Power of Words book series. Please visit our website at www.ctvoicesofhope.org to see all of our upcoming events and learn how to get involved. If you haven't had a chance to read Into the Forest, one of Smithsonian Magazine's best history books of 2021, and we just learned a finalist for the 2021 National Jewish Book Awards, please get your copy today. Congratulations, Rebecca. We hope you will join us on January 30th to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day at 7 p.m. It marks the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Please see the link in the chat to register. Thank you for your participation tonight. Take care, be well, and stay safe.